Let me welcome you all to this book talk, online book talk that Roberta Kwall is going to give this evening on her new book, Remixed Judaism, Preserving Tradition in a Diverse World. Roberta Rosenthal Kwall is the Raymond P. Nero Professor at DePaul University College of Law. Professor Kwall earned her JD degree from University of Pennsylvania and received her undergraduate degree in religious studies from Brown University. She also has a master's degree in Jewish studies. She's an internationally renowned scholar and lecturer and has published over 30 articles on a wide variety of topics, including Jewish law and culture, authorship rights, and intellectual property. She's the author of several law casebooks that are used nationally, as well as two monographs, The Myth of the Cultural Jew, Culture and Law in Jewish Tradition, and The Soul of Creativity. I am so excited to hear from Roberta Bobby, who she likes to be called. I have muted everybody. We are asking just some housekeeping to put your questions in the chat, and we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. I'm also going to post a link where you can buy the book on her book, Remixed Judaism, on Amazon. And with that, I would like to welcome Bobby.
Well, thank you so much. I am so excited to be with you all here tonight. This wasn't the book tour I envisioned, right? Because nothing that we're doing these days is what we envisioned. But one of the wonderful things about the online Zoom culture that has developed is that it really enables us to really reach across the miles and to speak with people that we perhaps wouldn't otherwise have that opportunity. So this is wonderful. And I'm particularly honored to have been asked by JTS to participate in this. So thank you so much. I always enjoy hearing the backstory of a book, why someone wrote the book that they did. And this book, Remixed Judaism, which has been out for a few months now, actually does have a backstory to it. So as Naomi mentioned, I started my career and spent actually many years writing about intellectual property. And one day I decided to read a book by Daniel Boorstin, who was the former Librarian of Congress. He wrote this 1,000-page book called The Creators, which was the whole history of human creation. So I spent a whole summer just reading this book and not doing any writing. And early on in the book, he said something fascinating to me, which I had never thought of. He said, and I believe that he was Jewish, and he said the creation narratives in Bereshit, in Genesis, furnish a pathway for man to think of himself as a creator. Well, I mean, I've read those narratives, so many times, but that never really, and I've written about creativity at that point for years, but I never put that together, that the creation narratives in Bereshit really furnish a pathway for man to think of himself, herself as a creator. So I thought this was fascinating. And from there, I said to myself, if I'm writing about authors' rights in particular, I want to understand what the Jewish tradition has to say about why people create. So one thing led to another. And I got very, very deep into the research and actually decided to go get a master's degree in Jewish studies. And while I was studying for my master's degree and still teaching law, I realized that the way I tend to think about law generally is that law is really a function largely of human input. Of course, in the Jewish tradition, we believe that there's this divine core. Of course we do. But that law is really a function of historicity, and it's a function of context, and it's a function of time. And there's a whole genre of law scholarship called cultural analysis that really discusses law in these terms. So I realized that I was a cultural analysis scholar. And then I realized that I could really write a history of halakha using cultural analysis theory. And that book, The Myth of the Cultural Jew, is really the precursor to remixed Judaism. So I wrote a lot of The Myth of the Cultural Jew, and The Myth of the Cultural Jew is an academic book. It was published by Oxford Press, has a lot of footnotes, and I did a lot of those chapters as independent studies for my master's degree. My mentor on that book actually was Rabbi Vernon Kurtz, who is the rabbi of North Shore, he's the rabbi emeritus now of North Shore Suburban Synagogue in Highland Park, where I live. I did not know Rabbi Kurtz before I started studying with him, but I became so enraptured that I said to my husband we needed to move to Highland Park so I could go to Bethel, and that's exactly what we ended up doing. And Rabbi Kurtz actually, he's a wonderful, wonderful intellect for those of you who know him. And he really, had a big influence, on that book. And really what The Myth of the Cultural Jew is, it's really a history of halakha from the time of the Torah through the Talmud to the present day. And it really shows how law and culture are completely intertwined. You cannot take halakha, Jewish law, and you can't separate that from Jewish culture because the culture has influenced the law and the law has influenced the culture. And oftentimes when I speak at synagogues, I'll sometimes break the ice, particularly if I'm speaking about that book, and I'll say to my audience, try to name one thing that we do as Jews that doesn't have a legal basis to it. Something that we do as Jews, that's familiar to Jews, that's associated with Jews, that does not have any basis at all in the law. And more often than not, someone does come up with the one thing that I have actually found that doesn't have a basis, and that's bagels and lox. I can't find any halachic basis for bagels and lox. However, pretty much everything else we do as Jews, including, our commitment to tikkun olam, including, much of how we eat, including pretty much everything we do has a basis in Jewish law, even if many Jews don't often realize that. So as I was finishing up The Myth of the Cultural Jew around 2013, a study came out, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It was called the 2013 Pew Report. And when it was the first major study, it was the most comprehensive study, I should say, of the American Jewish community. And once the Pew 2013 report came out, and it came out in October of 2013, so it's been roughly exactly 7 years. For those of you who don't know, Pew 2020 is due out any day, and many of us are just waiting with bated breath. What is it going to show? But after Pew 2013 came out, there was a lot of hand-wringing in the Jewish community. You couldn't pick up a Jewish piece of Jewish media, be it JTA or the Forward or the Jewish Journal or E-Jewish Philanthropy without seeing scores of articles being written and a lot of hand-wringing. Okay, why hand-wringing? Well, there was some good messages from the Pew Report, but there was some not so good messages. And one of the not so good was that there was an increasing number of Jews who call themselves Jews of no religion. These are Jews who are Jewish by birth. They may be identified Jewishly culturally. Maybe they'll even call themselves cultural Jews, even though I said that was a myth in my last book. But they don't practice. They just don't practice. And that number is growing. And that is cause for a lot of concern among the larger Jewish community. So when I was finishing up The Myth of the Cultural Jew, I really wanted to write about the American Jewish community and offer some direction and some guidance. And Rabbi Kurtz again said, Bobby, you know what? You're doing enough with this book. Leave that for another day. Well, I knew as I finished the epilogue of The Myth of the Cultural Jew, I knew what my next book would be. And I knew I had the title Remixed Judaism because I knew that what I wanted to really write about was a guidebook that was essentially geared toward what I would call the religiously liberal community. And I'll define who I mean by that in a minute. But I wanted to write a guidebook for how Jews who consider themselves religiously liberal still can practice Judaism in a way that taps into the tradition, that allows them to draw a deep meaning from Jewish practices, even if they're not dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's of halakha. And I felt it was really important to write a book that would discuss this in detail, because I believe with all my heart and soul that Jewish ritual is not only beautiful and not only needs to survive for all of our sakes, but also because there's so many people that want to tap into this, but just are not sure how. It can seem overwhelming. It can seem, a lot of times Jews don't know where to start. And we're talking about even Jews that are affiliated with synagogues, that have been affiliated their whole life. But when it comes to the practice of Judaism, the rituals of Judaism, that's something we really do not talk a lot about, okay? Even in our synagogue life, we have a lot of programs on Israel, thank God, and we have a lot of programs sometimes on politics. We have a lot of program on Tikkun Olam. We're starting to see lots of programming on LGBTQ and social justice, and that's all wonderful. But about ritual, I think there's a notion that, well, we know there, been there, done that. People know what to do. And I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure that people know what to do. And based on my many conversations with Jews across the entire spectrum, there's a lot of conversations that we can be having about how to more meaningfully engage with Jewish ritual. So that is the story. That is the backstory to Remixed Judaism. So I mentioned that I conceived of this book as one that would really be geared toward religiously liberal Jews. And so who are these Jews? Well, in my mind, I define religiously liberal Jews as Jews who are basically not living within the halachic system. That would include the majority of conservative Jews, all the way to the left to Reform and Reconstructionist and Humanist and beyond. Okay, so it's Jews who are not really, again, living according to halakha, living within the halachic system. As it turned out, there were many groups of audiences that I hadn't envisioned when I was writing this book. For example, I didn't really think anybody who denominated as Orthodox would find anything, particularly that would resonate with them necessarily. My assumption would be if you're Orthodox, they're pretty much, doing a lot of the things that I'm suggesting, but even in a way that, of course, is more characteristic of Orthodox practice. But I've been reminded by Rabbi Avi Feingold, with whom he and I do a monthly show called Remix Your Judaism on Jewish Life Connect. And he is a modern Orthodox rabbi, and he's married to a Maharat who is clergy at a synagogue in Montreal, a modern Orthodox synagogue in Montreal. And he said, a lot of times the mindfulness that you talk about in Remix Judaism and the importance of intentionality, we don't talk about that as much as we need to in Orthodoxy. And I thought, oh, all right, that's really interesting. I didn't envision as an audience for my book the formerly from, but when I was in New York a couple years ago, prior to COVID, and giving a talk at NYU, actually Professor Summer was on the panel with me. A gentleman came up to me afterwards and he said, the formerly from need to hear about Remixed Judaism. And sure enough, they now have a journal called Apikoros. It's a new journal geared toward the formerly from, and they did a book review actually of Remixed Judaism last month. I didn't think Israelis would really need Remixed Judaism because, as most of you know, when you're in Israel, when you're living in Israel, your life and your surroundings take on a completely different complexion than is the case here in the United States. To live as a Jew in Israel, you're on Jewish time. You're surrounded by Hebrew. You are just living, even if you're not observant, you're just living a more intrinsically Jewish life. You are the majority culture in Israel. That's so different from Jews here, even if you're living on the Upper West Side of New York, right? Or in a very Jewish area. We know we are still not the majority religious culture in the United States, and that makes a big difference. And yet, what I learned from my students whom I teach at Herzliya Law School, the Interdisciplinary Center, what I've learned from them was that, yeah, they're not religious, but there's a name for what they do. do, and a lot of what they do and how they live as Jews is very consistent with remixed Judaism. So it's interesting to me that the book has actually found gained traction among a large spectrum of Jews, much more so than I would have thought. I wrote this book. I was given the advice to write this book for my girls. I have 3 daughters, they're millennials. And someone, when I started writing this, a Jewish studies person, gave me that advice, write this book for your girls. And if any of you have read it, you know that they gave me a lot of material to play with, both they and their boys, their spouses gave me much material to play with in this book. But what I've also realized is that the age range, has actually, again, been very broad. I've had young people, even the age of my law students, read the book and tell me how much they've enjoyed it. And of course, all the way up to grandparents, because I have a chapter on grandparents, and many people have told me they have loved that chapter the best because, that relates to so much of what so many people I know are going through and the kinds of things they're going through when it comes to trying to navigate that delicate line between their practices and those of their children and their grandchildren. So now we get to the question of, all right, so what is it really that remixed Judaism is trying to do and trying to tap into, and what is it based on? So after my book was published, former Chancellor Arnold Eisen was awarded the Marshall Sklar Award. And he wrote a lecture, he gave a lecture, which was ultimately published in the journal Contemporary Jury. And it was published in 2019 when he won this award. And reading his lecture, again, my book was already, it was being put to bed at that point. So this is not in my book, but he really makes the case for remixed Judaism. All right, so I want to tell you a little bit about what Chancellor Eisen said in his Marshall Sklar lecture. He said that based on his wide experience going to synagogues all over the country and frankly, the world, he said that based on his perception, rabbis, congregants, and their neighbors do not, I'm quoting now, literally believe many of the words they utter in prayer or their explanations that are officially attached to the rituals they performed, but they still find great meaning in these prayers and rituals. He went on to say, it's not uncommon for Jews to engage in behaviors that are not warranted by their beliefs. And he said this is even true for himself. He provides a compelling case for remix. So by performing Jewish ritual, I suggest that we can get a sense of well-being in what we are doing, and that the reasons why we may do something may or may not have anything to do with the original reasons why these traditions first surfaced and they first appeared. And yet, it is vitally important that we continue to tap into these traditions. I want to, at this point, read a narrative. And this narrative is actually from the Talmud. I use a lot of narrative in remixed Judaism. Some of the stories are from my family. Some of the stories are things that I found in media. Some of the stories, involve my friends. But I also use a lot of stories that we call Agadah, from the Jewish tradition, both from the Torah, from the Talmud. And I don't summarize when I do, for example, Talmudic Agadah. I don't summarize the text in my own words. I actually do a complete English translation because it's important to me that my readers put themselves in the world of the Torah and the Talmud so that they can understand the world of the rabbis who shaped our tradition. I think that's really important. So this particular narrative, which is from the tractate Ta'anit of the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, is about a gentleman named Honi. And the point of this narrative is really the motivating reason why I wrote a book called Remixed Judaism. One day, Honi was journeying on the road and he saw a man planting a carob tree. He asked him, "How long does it take for this tree to bear fruit?" The man replied, 70 years. He then further asked him, "Are you certain you will live another 70 years?" The man replied, "I found ready-grown carob trees in the world as my forefathers planted them for me, so too do I plant them for my children." Honi sat down to have a meal, and sleep overcame him. As he slept, a rocky formation enclosed upon him and hid him from sight, and he continued to sleep for another 70 years. This is, after all, Talmudic narrative. When he awoke, he saw a man gathering the fruit of the carob tree, and he asked him, "Are you the man who planted the tree?" The man replied, "I am his grandson." So I love that narrative. I always tear up when I read it because it has such a powerful message. I see Jewish tradition as the fruit of the carob tree. We always want a world in which that fruit exists. Even if that fruit tastes a little bit different from the fruit 100 years ago and looks a little bit different, it's so important for the world to continue to have carob fruit. And that, to me, that narrative is a paradigm for the importance of Jewish tradition. So what is remix exactly? What are the elements of remix? My argument is that it's possible for individuals to find an authentic and yet personal meaning in Jewish tradition when certain criteria exist. Okay, so what are these criteria? First of all, people exercise individuality as to what rituals and traditions they want to incorporate in their lives. The truth of the matter is that religiously liberal Jews do not operate according to divine command. Okay, and this is what Chancellor Eisen was saying. People don't do what they do because God commanded that we do that. I'm not saying that I don't have sympathy for that viewpoint. All right, I'm actually pretty traditional in my thought process and my thinking. But the truth of the matter is, if you're going to try to reach people and persuade them that more Jewish tradition is important, you're not going to do that by saying it's commanded. They have to find a reason to do it that resonates with them. And part of that starts with selection, because they're not going to do everything. Okay, there's going to be individual choice involved in the ritual that they do choose to do. And secondly, people have to infuse into the tradition that they are doing their own personal meaning. And that meaning, can be varied. I mean, it depends on the person. It depends on the particular ritual. It can be connecting with the past. It can be, talking to your ancestors as you light your Shabbos candles. It can be something that because it just makes you feel good or grateful or mindful, but it has to be something that matters to you, because that's what's important. If it matters to you, you will do it. And that brings me to the next element, which is, and this is particularly important when you're talking about transmitting the tradition down the line to the next generation, the tradition has to be performed consistently. If you're trying to infuse your family, your kids, your grandkids with a certain type of Jewish tradition that will be meaningful to them, you can't do it every so often. Whatever it is that you're doing has to be performed with some consistency. And it also has to tap in to the authenticity of the tradition. In other words, it can't be something that comes completely out of left field that's not at all tethered to our authentic Jewish past. Finally, and I think this is also so important, especially when it comes to transmission, you've got to focus on the joy. It really has to be all about the joy. And as we all know, in Jewish tradition, there's a lot of do nots, right? There's a lot of do nots. When you're dealing with your kids, again, if you're in religiously liberal circles, if you're going to focus on the do nots, that's not going to be productive. But if you focus on the do's, if things are made special and joyous and performed consistently, you've got, I believe, a good chance of transmitting that. So we'll talk a little bit about some examples of that and how I think it can work. But, you know, one cute story that actually is also not in the book because it happened after I wrote the book, but I think it really does illustrate the remix concept. So we're going to talk a little bit about Shabbat, and we're going to talk a lot about food because those are always fun topics to talk about. We'll see what other people want to also ask about in the chat. But this happened, again, this was probably right before COVID. I was driving somewhere and one of my daughters called me. And she said, Mom, she said, you know what? I have to tell you something. Jeremy, her fiance, he has given up eating pork. Well, this was like music to my ears. I was ecstatic because I keep thinking, this is great. There won't be any pork products in the home of my grandchildren one day. I said, Rachel, this is great. This is wonderful. I'm so excited. Does he want to connect more with his religion? Is that what's in back of this? And she said, no, not at all. And I said, oh. Okay. So I said, so what's the motivation here? And she said, well, you know, he doesn't want to eat pork because he feels badly for the pigs. And I said, oh, okay. And I'm thinking to myself, having wrote the book on remix Judaism, well, I can work with this. This is okay. But then I remembered that his favorite food is hamburgers. That's his favorite food. And I said, well, wait a minute, is he giving up hamburgers too? And she said, oh, no, Mom, he's eating hamburgers. Well, I was totally confused at that point. I was driving. This occurred. I remember I was driving. And I said to her, I'm confused. What's the difference? He's still eating hamburgers. He feels badly for the pigs. And then I could feel her looking at me through the telephone. We were not on FaceTime. As I said, I was driving. And she said, Mom, don't you know? Clearly not. The pigs are just treated so much worse than the cows. And I was like, oh, okay. Didn't really know that, but it works for me. And then we had a long conversation about that. And I said, well, you know, I think that's a good thing because after all, you know, you won't have pork in your home and your kids will understand not only, you know, does your husband feel badly for the pigs, and that's fine, but also this isn't something that Jews do. This is a Jewish tradition and you're going to be honoring Jewish tradition. To me, that's a great example of remix. Because, you know, so our two main ritual pillars, you know, one is Shabbat, of course, and the other one is kashrut. And so to be tapping into any of these traditions, I think is really, really important. I talk a lot about Shabbat because Shabbat is one of the easiest, lowest hanging fruit, you know, for people that want to start tapping into a personally based and a home-based tradition. And, you know, going through this now with my grandson, I have one grandchild at this point, and seeing him get so excited about Shabbat. And again, we're not talking about people that are following the laws of halakha, but he understands that Friday night, you know, Friday afternoon, his mom makes a challah and he gets all excited and he likes to say the motzi and he has a whole Shabbat set up at his house. Apparently they have these toy kits where you can, like, you know, have, you know, play challah and play wine, and it's wonderful. This is the kind of thing that can really generate such positive feelings about Jewish tradition. And this is unique Jewish tradition. This is not universalism. This is particular to our tradition. Oftentimes people will say to me, well, you know, I can't get home on time to light my candles. So what should I do? You know, and I get this question actually a lot, and not being that I'm not a rabbi and I don't have to necessarily be overly concerned about, you know, in how I respond. I can just give them my individual take on this. You know, the question that I always ask when people say to me, should I light my candles before sundown? And people ask that a lot, actually. I say, look, you know, do you believe it's a sin to strike a match? And usually, and my kids have asked me this too, and usually they say, well, of course not. We don't believe it's a sin to strike a match, you know. And then I say, well, you know, then light your candles, because what you're doing is you are setting aside that time. You are sending a message to your family that you are now separating yourself from the prior week. You're entering into Shabbat. The candle lighting is a beautiful imagery of that. And if you don't believe it's a sin to strike a match, then of course, light your Shabbat lights. I mean, I don't do that. I light my candles before sundown. That's important to me. But I think it's important to be able to say to people that don't tap in, you know, to that idea of prohibiting the fire, which the Torah, of course, prohibits. But for people for whom that doesn't resonate, then of course, light your candles and bring Shabbat into your home. Religiously liberal Jews have an interesting, there are two, I call them two A words. There are two A words that religiously liberal Jews prize both, but they're complete dichotomies in terms of in terms of philosophy and purpose. So one of these A words I mentioned before, and that's authenticity. I talked about the importance of authenticity being an important element for remixed Judaism, because whatever you're doing does have to be steeped in the tradition, and that is where authenticity comes in. And actually, religiously liberal Jews and people generally love the word authenticity. That's a word that has tremendous purchase, particularly in liberal communities, because where something's authentic is perceived as good. It's a positive thing, right? But the other A word that also resonates really well with religiously liberal Jews is autonomy, right? And those are mutually inconsistent oftentimes. And that actually relates largely to the discussion of food and the discussion of kashrut, because yes, we have this authentic tradition, and yet autonomy, and especially when it comes to food, autonomy is something that's really important to a lot of religiously liberal Jews. When I wrote my chapter on food, my agent suggested that I get the stories of celebrity chefs. I had no idea how I was supposed to do that. And I said that to her, and she said, well, Bobby, go look at cookbooks, Jewish cookbooks. And it's like, okay, I'm not someone who loves being in the kitchen. That's not really my thing. But I went to my synagogue library. We have a huge library, and I got every single book I could possibly get my hands on to get the stories of the chefs. So, well, she was right. I was able to find a lot of stories. But I also interviewed a celebrity chef that I actually have known for 20 years. Her name is Laura Frankel. She's actually very, very active in the conservative Jewish world. And she was the proprietor of the restaurant Shallot's. There was one in New York and there's one in Chicago. And she said to me that she thinks for many Jews, food is the final frontier. She said in her experience working with, all kinds of Jews for 30 plus years now, people just don't want to be told what they can eat and what they can't eat. And I suspect that she's right, But what was interesting about the stories of the chefs is that even the Jewish celebrity chefs that do not necessarily keep kosher personally and whose establishments may or may not be kosher, what matters to them is authenticity. So, for example, Michael Solomonoff, he is the proprietor of Zahav in Philadelphia. I know prior to COVID, you needed months in order to make a reservation, months in advance to get into his restaurant. He's a multi-time James Beard Award winner. He was actually born in Israel, raised in Pittsburgh, went back to work in Israel, and that's where he sort of honed his culinary skills. He does not keep kosher personally. His restaurant is not kosher per se, but he finds it important in running an establishment for Israeli cuisine to honor some basic rules of keeping kosher, because that's what gives his establishment its authenticity. And I found that same concern and regard for authenticity being articulated by Zach the Baker in Miami, whose restaurant actually is kosher, and by other celebrity chefs who write about the importance of authenticity in cuisine. And so again, that balance between authenticity and autonomy is a really important one for religiously liberal Jews. And in essence, that's the balance that remixed Judaism is trying to get at. The other narrative that I want to read to you tonight is actually also about food, but this one draws from my family and some of the issues that we had raising our girls on the subject of food. So my experience raising a family has allowed me to understand more fully the value of a remixed approach to kashrut. Our daughters and their partners keep only some aspects of kashrut, and some more so than others. Candidly, when we were raising our children, they struggled with being restricted with food choices, especially when eating outside the home. In order to help maintain a degree of clarity and consistency, my husband and I devised a family contract to help avoid some of the issues that were surfacing during their teenage and early adult years. This is the time when children are eating out with their friends or in college, and families lose whatever control they might have had over prior food selections. Our contract, which has become known as the DOE, the doctrine of dining out, essentially prohibits pork, shellfish, and blatant mixing of meat and milk during the same course when we dine outside our home as a family. We wrote this out and we had each member of our family sign it. We still have it. I still have a copy till this day. As our daughters began developing relationships and bringing boys into the fold, none of whom really grew up with the degree of keeping kosher that we had, we actually had them sign it as well. And sometimes the boys were even far more cooperative than the girls. And one of the funny things was I had actually forgotten the genesis of the dodo, but we recently celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary, and our girls gave us this wonderful book of 40 years of Kwall memories, but they devoted an entire page to the dodo, which brought back exactly why we had to do this contract. We were sitting in a restaurant, we were in Florida, where we typically go over the winter, and one of our daughters ordered a veggie burger with cheese. Okay, that was fine. She then got up, I forgot, I blocked this all out. She got up at one point after we ordered to go to the restroom, and she nabbed the server and said, you can just make that a regular hamburger. So when the server brought it back, I apparently was sitting next to her, and I looked at it and I could tell instantly that was not a veggie burger. And that sort of led to a lot of yelling and screaming, and that is how the dodo was born. And everybody laughs about this now. So I want to maybe save some time for questions and discussion and whatever is responding to the chat. But I want to close with another sweet little story of remix. And before I do that, I thought I would also just tell you a little bit about what other topics I cover in the book. We've talked about Shabbat and holidays. And I concentrate mostly on Shabbat, but I do talk about a number of the other Jewish holidays as well. In fact, I was just a few weeks ago on the podcast Unorthodox, which was so much fun. The hosts are phenomenal. And I talked about, they wanted me to talk about how you can remix Shemini Atzeret and Hoshana Rabbah, probably the two least known Jewish holidays. So we had a lot of fun with that. I have a chapter on marriage. And my chapter on marriage, in order for that chapter to be authentic, I really had to deal not just with marriage, but I also had to deal and did deal with the questions of intermarriage and some of the and what intermarriage and how remix and intermarriage blend together. And I treated that topic very extensively. I have a chapter on children's Jewish education and some of the incredible developments that have occurred over the past 20 years in Jewish education, including synagogue education, as well as other options that are coming along. And of course, that also addresses the B'nai Mitzvah situation. I have a chapter on Tikkun Olam. And I explained in that chapter why Tikkun Olam is important. It's an important element of remix, but it cannot be the whole of remix. And so I developed that in that chapter. I have a chapter, of course, on Jewish mourning, and I do think the mourning rituals have a tremendous staying power, even among the least religious Jews. I do think there's something about our mourning traditions that still really, really resonate with them. Of course, the chapter on grandparents, which is told completely through a narrative lens. I make up 3 fictional grandparents with all different issues that they face and how they can navigate their grandchildren's Jewish journey. And finally, my epilogue, deals with questions such as faith. Where does faith come in, fluidity, and some of the emergent Jewish institutions that we're seeing now. So it really does kind of cover the whole, gamut, a large portion of the gamut of Jewish experience. So I want to close my remarks with a very, very sweet story. And this one actually was a story that I read in our local Federation, Chicago Federation Monthly magazine. And it's a story of a young mom in this area who, they are not a traditionally observant family. I think her family belongs to a Reform synagogue. And, they're, again, she would describe herself as culturally Jewish, perhaps, but certainly not traditionally observant. Her little boys were having trouble going to sleep at night. And she didn't really know what to do. They were in preschool at the time. So she decided to lay down with each of her boys separately and had them she sang with them the first line of the Shema. She thought it would settle them down so they would be less afraid of, bad dreams and going to sleep at night. And she said that it worked and it settled them down and they got some comfort. And she writes about how she loves hearing a little bit of Torah. And that's what she wrote in her article, on their little lips before they drift off to sleep. Now, why is this remix? Well, actually, it has an authentic base in the tradition. And I don't know whether this young mom even knew that necessarily, but there's a special Shema that observant Jews say before they go to bed, the Shema Mita, the bedtime Shema. But that's not why she was doing this. She wasn't doing this because it's commanded to do this. She was doing this to have her little boys get some quietude and peace and calmingness before they went to sleep at night. But now, her sons now, I think, are 9 and 7 and 5, so they're a little bit older. And they each say that line themselves before they go to bed at night. So again, that shows the importance of the consistency and the continuity and the positive connotation that can be derived from our beautiful tradition. So at this point, I think it would be fun to open it up to look at the chat and see what's on people's minds. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Bobby. This was fascinating. Let me start with some of the questions that have come up. A lot about the kosher food. Cindy asks, how can there be authentic kosher chefs if they're not personally keeping kosher?
Okay, so I just want to be clear what I said when I was talking about that. The chefs, like, for example, Michael Solomonov, who was one that I mentioned, he personally does not keep kosher, but he feels it's important that his cuisine at Zahav represent authentic Israeli cuisine, which for him means in his restaurant honoring some fundamentals of the kashrut tradition. Okay, so I did not say, in fact, I think I said that he does not himself personally, keep kosher.
Somebody asked, Fran and Warren asked, how does this preserve Judaism? I'm a conservative Jew, but I do feel concerned that without the ritual compliance, Judaism will not survive. Orthodoxy is too unbending, but it has kept our people alive. What do you think about this?
I think about this all the time. I think about this, people always say, like, what kind of things keep you up at night? Actually, that keeps me up at night. And that's why I wrote Remix Judaism. So, I think it's, I think it's pretty clear to anyone who reads the book that I am very traditionally observant. Okay. Personally, I am Shomer Shabbat. I am Shomer Kashrut. But I'm also aware, very much aware, that even in conservative communities, people are not following, they are not following halakha necessarily. You can look at the statistics, you can look at the Pew Report, which doesn't even talk about, of 2013, it doesn't even talk about complete keeping kosher. It has a question of a kosher home, however you define that. And I think the percentages for conservative Judaism, for those who denominate as conservative in that survey, is roughly 25%. Okay, that's a minority of conservative Jews. Once you go further to the left, it's even less than that. And so if you're asking me, do I think the more tradition, the better? Of course, I think that. There's no question that I think that, but I think it's really important that we have to meet people where they are. And if people, people are not going to be observing everything, but I do think the conversation in religiously liberal communities, and particularly in synagogue communities, has to focus more on ritual. With the understanding that people aren't going to be doing everything, but there's an importance for people to be able to be doing ritual, okay, and to be doing ritual consistently. So I actually agree with the premise of that question. But if people were going to be inclined to be keeping, the entirety of the halakhic system, unfortunately, those people are largely not populating religiously liberal communities. And I say this from not just survey research, and there's a lot of that out there, but I also, I have a lot of anecdotal experience that really, consistently backs that up. So again, that ritual conversation is really important. It's one we need to be having and we need to be more engaged in.
So on the other side, Samantha asks, what kind of response have you gotten from Chabad on remixed Judaism? Chabad's celebration of a single mitzvah in and of itself seems to be spiritually echoed in your approach to Jewish practice.
Sure, that's a great question. So, it's actually really interesting. I do know personally several Chabad rabbis, and I have some very close friends who are actually, they're not Chabad, but they're Haredi, and they do kiruv, they do outreach. So, and they're very well aware of what I'm doing. The best answer to that question, what matches my response, was actually an observation that was made by Professor Jack Wertheimer of JTS in his award-winning book, The New American Judaism, that came out, I believe, in 2019. And he talks about this very issue. And he says that off the cuff, okay, because his book was based on interviews of 160 rabbis from all denominations. And Jack talks about the fact that, privately, right, what the kiruv outreach rabbis will tell him, whether they're Chabad or just, other ultra-Orthodox type denominations, is that success, what does it look like? It looks like being more involved in your conservative synagogue or your Reform synagogue and marrying Jewish. That's how they define success. The difference, okay, is, are there some parallels with what I'm doing and what they would do? Some parallels, okay, but there are some differences too, because a Chabad rabbi would never say it's okay for you to light your candles after sundown. They would never say that because they don't think that that's okay. They may say, it's okay for you to light candles, and if you can't do more than that, okay, whatever, but they will never tell you that it's okay to do something in a way that is going to violate halakha. Remixed Judaism is a different type of approach. Remixed Judaism is sort of acknowledging that people are not going to be performing ritual in the way that is performed in normative Orthodox communities. And if you want any proof of that, just think about Zoom and think about the Zoom teshuvah that was issued by the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Conservative Movement this past spring. It's an extremely well done teshuvah. I've actually studied it thoroughly. I'm writing about it for another project, actually. And it's very clear that the author of that teshuvah, Rabbi Howler, there's a little bit of, I'm going to interpret it as discomfort, because they realize that some of what's in there has the potential to violate halakha. Okay, and it's there. You don't even have to read between the lines. But it was issued for reasons that were seen as really important in enabling conservative Jews to connect. And not all conservative synagogues, or many of them, were not streaming services prior to COVID. And so I think that's a good reminder that the norms of the conservative community and certainly the Reform community, and to the left of that, are different normative practices than what is normative and prescriptive in Orthodoxy. And so what I'm saying is remixed Judaism has to acknowledge the norms of the community and be realistic about the norms of the community, and then work to basically allow those norms to blossom with more ritual, so that when it comes time to be transmitting down the line to the next generation, it will be a fuller and more meaningful type of tradition, even if it's not completely in accordance with normative halakha.
Okay, so we have lots of comments, not only questions.
Yeah.
One person, interestingly, writes that they advise people that they can have one room that's a Shabbat room. This is very much remixed Judaism.
Yeah.
So in that room, usually the dining room, no electronics, phone, tablets, etc., a time for lights if possible. There are others who
That's great, by the way.
yeah, I
like
think
that.
it's wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So how can we, Howard asked, how can we use an understanding of these concepts to create meaningful programs to attract individuals to our synagogues?
Well, that is a great question. And the idea of attracting individuals to synagogues and meaningful programs, that may or may not mesh together, right? I think all synagogues, be it conservative, reform, reconstructing Judaism, all of them are really trying to attract more people. Okay. Whether, I think that's a conversation that many synagogues were very engaged in before COVID. What that's going to look like post-COVID, I think we're still trying to figure that out and don't necessarily have the answers available to us right now. But I think one of the things that we do have to think about has to do with the generational differences. For people who are baby boomers, and certainly the generation ahead of that, the greatest generation, there were normative assumptions that were very different from the assumptions of Generation X, millennials, and now the current Gen Z. So what do I mean? But this goes to how to attract people. So what do I mean by that? So, certainly the greatest generation, my parents, the baby boomers, a lot of times we did things because they were expected of us. There was an acquiescence that many of us had religiously. And I think that, that synagogues certainly flourished, and we saw a growth of synagogues, during the years where people from those generations were, the primary, consumers of synagogue life. I think sort of beginning with Generation X, and these are people, now the very late 30s to maybe early to mid 50s, that's not a generation you see a lot of. I mean, you can go even to the most traditional conservative synagogues. You do not see a lot of people in that age range. When you get even younger than that, you see even fewer. I recently had on our show, I mentioned my Jewish Live Connect show with that Rabbi Feingold and I co-host. But our first guest, we inaugurated that show with Rabbi Joshua Rabin, who's the head of teen engagement for the United Synagogue. And Rabbi Rabin was one of the people who had read and actually endorsed my book. And so I knew he was familiar with it. And I thought, look, he's dealing with the next generation. Who better than to join us for our first episode? And he said some things that they really didn't surprise me. But, he talked about what services look like now, for the kids that he's dealing with. And the kids he's dealing with are Gen Z. Okay, that's our youngest documented generation, born 1995 to 2010. These are the people sitting in my classrooms, even as law students. And he said, that the kinds of things that we were willing to just sort of, attend or whatever, that doesn't resonate necessarily. Sitting in services doesn't necessarily resonate. Gen Z is not big on organized religion, and that's also true of their millennial, their older cousins who are millennials, and certainly their Gen X parents. So synagogues, I think, really need to to face the reality that what they can do to attract the next generation is going to require a lot of thought. And particularly for the conservative movement, I think that thought is going to have to it's going to have to involve a lot of really creative thinking, because the challenge for conservative Judaism is that we still have that, halachic core. Reform doesn't have to deal with that, and they can do, different kinds of things that are not normative within the conservative movement. Again, they were streaming services long before conservative synagogues were. But I do think it's a challenge, because what you typically see in the conservative movement is the young people who really want religion and really get into it often go to the right. And the ones more often than not, they just are not that interested. So yeah, we do have to think about this. Now, to me, that's where showing your kids and your grandkids the beauty of the tradition, focusing on those wonderful elements. Who gets to have, a night that they set aside where we can all have dinner, and maybe you turn off your phone for an hour and you have some delicious challah and you have some wine and you have a dessert. And maybe you just do, if nothing else, the first paragraph of Birchat Hamazon, right? Even if every Jewish family did just that much, I can guarantee you the next Pew Report would look completely different and infinitely better than the 2013 report. So it's really about building the positives. And I do think that's what synagogues do need to focus on. And I do think synagogues also need to focus more on what goes on in the home, as opposed to just the institution. We need to have more conversations about how to get more people to do more, even if that more is the 1 hour, technology-free Shabbat dinner that I was just talking about a moment ago.
So I have somebody by the name of Alan who has a lot of comments about synagogues, and he wants to know if the synagogue, do you imagine it's possible for a synagogue to center on something other than ritual? If ritual is the purpose of the synagogue, then I wonder, what about the centrality of the synagogue in the future of Judaism? And then he goes on later on, and how do we attract people to the synagogue, which you just spoke about, and comment on your word of normative conservative Judaism, and notes that what's normative for the clergy and the written policy, you talked about the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, is very different from the normative of the laity, which you mentioned before, of the minority of conservative Jews keeping kosher. So those are his questions about the future of conservative Judaism, basically.
Sure. And I mean, look, I think there are challenges. Okay. There clearly are challenges. One of the things that does give me hope, however, specifically about the conservative movement, and look, it's no, if you were to read The Myth of the Cultural Jew and you were to read Remixed Judaism, it would come as no surprise that these books were written by a lifelong conservative Jew. I grew up in the movement. I'm actually speaking at the synagogue where I grew up in New Jersey in March, which I'm so excited about. I'm a product of the conservative movement. I went to USY on Wheels. I raised our daughters in a traditional conservative synagogue in Deerfield, where I live. And we currently belong to Bethel, which is a traditional conservative synagogue. So I am a product of the movement. I saw the value. I always say the best money we spent was Camp Ramah. That was the best money we spent in terms of our kids. So, I think about this all the time. I do have hope. Because when you look at certain criteria, you do still see more affinity for ritual among conservative Jews than other religiously liberal communities. There was a recent longitudinal study that actually just came out. It was done by professors at JTS, actually. And it was very interesting because the study followed, I think it was the 1995 B'nai Mitzvah class, and it followed them, for like a good 20 years, and they just issued their final set of findings. I think there was the fourth interview, which was intermittent over the years. And And what they found was very many interesting findings, but one of the takeaways was that those that continued to affiliate with the conservative movement had a higher level of ritual. Okay, and you see that. You can look at the Pew study. You see that there still is a higher level of Shabbat and Kashrut among conservative Jews. The norms still are higher for conservative Jews than other religiously liberal Jews, even though, Alan, I guess you're quite right that it's not at the level of the clergy. To me, that suggests that one of the jobs of the synagogues is to have more conversations about something like remixed Judaism and ritual. Okay, we need to be talking more about ritual. And I don't remember hearing a lot of sermons or programs that are just focused on ritual over the decades that I've belonged in the movement. It's not, because it's not considered as juicy or as sexy a topic as some other things. So I think that does, we do have our work cut out for us, for sure. In terms of in terms of tefillah, in terms of services, I think participation, singing, joy is going to be more attractive to people than a performance-oriented type of service. So those are things that certainly synagogue communities, can be thinking of. But I think it's just, upping that commitment to tradition. And I guess the last thing that I wanted to say in response to some of those comments is, the difference between Shabbat and Chagim and holidays, and the particularistic forms of our tradition, okay, the particularistic that not all Jews gravitate toward, that needs to be preserved, because that is what is uniquely Jewish. Tikkun Olam has uniquely Jewish roots, and the history of Tikkun Olam begins with Torah and is certainly there in the Talmud and beyond. But that's become very universalized. Everybody can be good people and can give tzedakah and can care about social justice. But not everybody does Shabbat the way Jews do Shabbat. We have to make that attractive to our core constituents, and we have to give people a reason to celebrate these traditions consistently and to find their own meaning in them.
We have lots more questions. One has to do with prayer. Where does that fit in? And where does Hebrew language fit in? And where is the concept of God in remixed Judaism?
Right. Those are great questions. So let's start with God. I talk about God in my epilogue. I talk about faith in my epilogue, and I talk about some of the studies of Jews and faith. And what we see is that faith in God is a fluid concept. More Jews believe in God, have faith than one would think, or that because a lot of times we also hear that there's a high percentage of agnostics or atheists, among Jews, more so than among Christians, and studies have sort of demonstrated that as well. But I think part of it is just there's a lot of fluidity that surrounds the idea of God and the idea of divine. I think a lot of people struggle with some of our history and the terrible things that have happened to Jews, over the millennia. And God can be a complicated concept. But, to me, remixed Judaism is not inconsistent with God. There's a lot of people that really do believe in God, but they're not necessarily halakhic Jews, because they don't necessarily believe that the whole rabbinic system, as it is currently in its current constitution, is something that God has necessarily dictated. Right? So belief in God is not inconsistent with remixed Judaism, but nor is it a requirement. And there are certainly many Jews who don't believe in God, but still are pretty observant. There's a whole group of Jews called social Orthodox who basically, they're doing it because they like the lifestyle. Okay. And again, this has been written about in Commentary Magazine and other places. So faith is certainly not inconsistent, but nor is it necessarily a prerequisite. Prayer, I think prayer is important. I mean, clearly, I think prayer is important. I think we do have to figure out, synagogues do have to figure out how to make the prayer accessible to our emerging younger group of people. One of the things that sort of does bother me is, in the conservative movement in which I grew up, we learned how to recite the Shmona Esrei. We learned how to recite the Amidah for Shabbat and even for, Rosh Chodesh. We learned these things. Knowing this is probably not as important to our current generations of younger people. And part of that bothers me, the Hebrew, the facility with Hebrew, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of practice to achieve that. And traditional prayer, if you do know Hebrew, is more meaningful than if you don't know Hebrew. But learning Hebrew is not necessarily easy for many people, nor do they have the time. So I do think these are hard questions. Again, Reform doesn't have to deal with these questions as much as conservative Judaism does, to the extent that our prayer communities have more of a halakhic structure. Again, I come back to focusing on participation, focusing on singing. People love the Misha Berach prayer because that can be sung, that can be memorized. People don't even understand the whole of what they're saying, but it has a catchy tune. And so, again,
participants, I please ask you to mute.
So
I'm going to mute everybody and then open you again.
Okay. So what I was saying is that I think prayer is challenging, and I do think that prayer may be one of the most challenging aspects for conservative communities, because the prayer structure that certainly my generation of conservative Jews grew up with, and even my daughters who are millennials that they saw in Ramah, is not necessarily what kids are doing right now, in USY. And my conversation with Joshua Rabin, sort of touched on that a little bit when we spoke. So I do think those are areas that the conservative movement really needs to be thinking thoughtfully about. But again, we're a creative people and we're a creative movement. And I have no doubt that with good minds thinking these things through and talent, we can do it. And I guess the last thing that I want to say about prayer, because prayer is something I think a lot about. I had the privilege last November, a year ago, to participate in a program that was sponsored by the New York Jewish Week called The Conversation. And what they did was they had they invite every year 50 Jewish thought leaders to come, and we meet on this incredibly wonderful kosher organic farm in Maryland. And we basically engage in conversation for 2 straight days. It was wonderful. And of course we have services. So they had Orthodox services, and then they had egalitarian services. And so it was Rosh Hodesh, one of the days. It was not over Shabbat. It was Rosh Hodesh. And so we had 2, I will be very candid and say, 2 superstars of the conservative movement actually led our service. And it was a morning, it was Shacharit. And one of them was Rabbi Lizzie Heidemann, who is here in Chicago. She is the leader of one of the emerging, synagogues, emerging institutions. I actually talk about that in the epilogue of Remix. And Rabbi Josh Warsawski, who is very young, but is quickly becoming like the musical icon of the conservative movement, was the other. And they led a Shacharit service that was awesome. I mean, it just was amazing. And I sat there and I thought, well, if this were a regular work week and I had to go get downtown afterwards, how would I feel about like an hour of, Hallel or whatever? And I don't know the answer to that, but what I do know is that it is possible to have a creative, participatory, and yet traditional service that will engage people. I know it's possible. I've seen it, but I do think that's an area synagogues need to work on.
Okay, so I have a really interesting comment, which this gentleman, David, has asked that you comment on. In my understanding, Judaism has been remixed hundreds of times over the millennia. For example, Hasidism, Musar, Reconstructionist, Orthodoxy, Rabbinic versus Tanakh Judaism, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, etc. Can you please comment on that?
Well, sure. We wouldn't be here today if we didn't have a good dosage of remix, and one of the points, one of my main points of the myth of the cultural Jew was to show exactly that, Torah, halakha didn't just drop out of the sky, right? Even Menachem Alon, the former deputy chief of the Supreme Court of Israel and an Orthodox Jew, said the Torah is from heaven, it is not in heaven. And I think that's what, this gentleman essentially is saying. We have been remixing it for millennia. I do think, however, that we have to be careful with that argument. That is an argument that liberal Judaism often relies on for doing a lot of changes. But again, when you're changing, you still have to keep, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and you also cannot let the norms of the surrounding culture completely overwhelm and overtake the particular traditional Jewish norms. And it's a balance, it's clearly a balance. But the problem is, the direction that we are going generally in the United States, where we live as a culturally religious minority, is that we have a group we have a growing and a strong group of people who are on the right, who are actually becoming even more intense in their religiosity. And this is something that you hear a lot in the Orthodox world, the slide to the right, the increasing amount of humras and stringencies. And then you have an increasingly liberally weakening of the particular norms. And what I'm saying is that's, to me, not an acceptable option where Judaism is a black and white world. We do need to have more of an appreciation for the gray. And by the way, that's always, I think, been the beauty of conservative Judaism. I think that's what conservative Judaism has always really tried, in theory, to do. Again, we need to be re-examining that theory and thinking about how that theory can continue to play out in ways that actually strengthen religious commitment as opposed to weaken it. Even in an environment and a world in which we are becoming, as an American society, increasingly secular. There's no doubt about that. And so we have to sort of fight back a little bit against that secularization, especially in our movement, because we do think that rooting in halakha is important.
So related to that, Lynn asks, how far afield can the ritual go and still be considered within bounds? For example, when we create a new ritual, there's often effort to frame it or sink it in with the familiar, even with long tethers. But then there are just some very new things, and those are welcoming to many Jews that I know. And related to that, Diane notes, what will happen if the practice of circumcision is now celebrated in many homes as a celebration without the actual circumcision? So this is, how far can we remix?
Yeah, I mean, look, that is the $64 million question, right? I am not trying to prescribe where I think the limits are and where they're not, because largely those are going to be decisions that are always going to be made on an individual level. And the whole thing of people who are inclined toward a remixed approach, which is, I think, the majority of American Jews, are always going to be setting their own limits, right? So it's not going to be, for me or anybody else to be saying this is okay and this isn't okay, right? So there's always going to be that fluidity. I mean, I will tell you that one of the narratives in my book that I talk about in the chapter on Shabbat, came from an article. It was in one of the Jewish media. I don't remember which one it's cited in here, but it talks about a young school teacher who was living in New Orleans. The title of her article was she makes the least kosher dinner, Shabbat dinner south of the Mason-Dixon line. And she talked about how she grew up in a Reform home where her mom made a big Friday night dinner every Friday night. And she talked about how she was in her late 20s when she wrote this. Since moving to New Orleans and teaching school, every Friday night, she invites all of her friends, Jews and non-Jews, to have a big Shabbat dinner. But, her choice of food included specialties in New Orleans, like crawfish, and anybody who ever spent time in New Orleans knows that it's a very, very treif town. and so, that was, and she said there's bread baking going on after sundown, and the food is, whatever. Now, when I first read that, I have to be honest, coming from a somewhat traditional perspective myself, it's like, oh, and then I sat and I thought about it and I said to myself, no, 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 no. I have to really retrain my mind, because this woman could be out doing what most people in their 20s are doing in New Orleans on a Friday night, and it's not having Shabbat dinner. But she's not doing that. She's honoring Shabbat in her own way, right? And so I really began to sort of think about why that's an important example, of remix. And another narrative I quote is by the novelist Ellen, I think it was Ellen Umansky, who talks about growing up in a home with 3 sets of dishes. I think there was milk and there was meat and I think there was Chinese food or something, right? And there again, it's like you can sit there and you can be judgmental and say, oh, well, that's not keeping kosher. Or you can say, okay, but you're honoring the tradition to some degree. And honoring it to some degree is certainly better than not honoring it at all, particularly if it's being honored in a consistent, joyful way and being presented to your progeny, to the next generation, as something valuable and wonderful and important. So again, it's not for me to judge what is and what isn't, kosher for remix. What I do believe is the more people can embrace Jewish tradition, be mindful of Jewish tradition, own their tradition, make it something that is seen as a positive and important, the better chance you're going to have of transmitting it to your kids, that's and your grandkids. If it's something that you don't care that much about and you don't make that much effort, or one doesn't make that much effort, you're going to see that down the line too. But this idea that it has to be perfect, it has to be in compliance, that's what I'm pushing back against, because that's just not realistic, for the vast majority of American Jews. And so that shouldn't be the norm.
I think in conclusion, I just want to say that there are a number of people who so appreciate what you had to say. And Fran and Warren wrote that wrote that I'm hopeful that your book can help me have conversations with my kids. And I think that's a wonderful ending to a beautiful book that talks so personally and with so much thought about Jews in America in the 21st century, and how their behaviors are changing and where the future of Judaism is going. And I really want to thank you for not only for writing this book and for thinking about all these challenging subjects that we all have, or certainly those who have participated here today have, but also for sharing your thoughts with us. And let me reiterate that your book is available on Amazon. So please run and go get it. And let's see if that'll go. Here's the link again. And just for all the participants, the library has a wonderful program of more book talks, and we're having more this week on Thursday. And if you check the JTS website, putting that in the chat, then you will see advertisement for more of these book talks, and would be happy to have you there. Come and be with us.
And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, I'm easy to find. I teach at DePaul. My email's online, so please, by all means, feel free to get in touch if you want to talk more. So.
And we are recording this program, and if anyone is interested in having a recording, if they missed something, then please be in touch with us at JTS. Thank you so much.